There's no association for equity for ugly peoples.
The Fugly Act of 1960.
Hi, I'm Andy,
And I'm Roger,
and welcome to The Middle,
where we try to have thoughtful conversations
about awkward topics.
on our search to find the middle.
We're going to give you last week's news today.
It's a slogan we should put on a t-shirt.
Stop touching her!
I am tonight announcing my candidacy.
Taylor Swift.
Look, my biggest issue with marriage is that I think that it's a fundamentally flawed institution that is built on the oppression of women.
I will not be lectured about sexism and misogyny.
Having truly rational conversations about controversial issues is risky these days.
G'day, Roger.
Andy, how you doing?
Yeah, not too bad. Welcome to episode 125.
Wow. Something I never thought we'd get up to.
We actually had a bit of an impromptu community meetup, I guess you might call it, the other weekend. You know, they were like, engaging with us as on the podcast. And there was a discussion about like, oh yeah, we're up to, episode 125. And like, what, really? You've done that many?
Yeah. I mean, it's actually quite strange. I don't know whether you feel this sometimes, but some of the more significant topics that we've done, I feel haven't been that long ago. And I have a quite strong memory of maybe our first, 30, 40 episodes. And I think that's because, we got a lot of the core themes out early. And then that has translated to like nuanced conversations of whether it be recent events or whatever it be afterwards. But I still feel like, that was almost like yesterday that we were doing those ones. So I don't know, the passage of time definitely is distorted for me.
I just like kind of track that like number along where other podcasts that I enjoy are along that number. So I'm like, oh yeah, we're up to the Sam Harris and Ezra Klein phase of the Making Sense podcast. Like, when they're arguing about Charles Murray, it's like, oh, that's where we're at. We're at that phase.
Yeah, well, I wonder if there's a conversion. You know how like they have dog years? I wonder if there's like a podcast episode years where what 125 means that you are now a teenager or something in terms of your your growth.
So Roger, you have a bit of an anecdote for us.
I wouldn't call it a listener question, but following on from a bit of real world encounters about discrimination in life, in work, and so on. And right now we know the culture wars have been raging for a long time, and we're all on the look out for this kind of stuff. Usually it takes the form of race, right? Race and religion and these kind of things. But I had an interesting conversation with someone who pretty much laid it out and said that actually she believes the true discrimination for people going through this world, whether it be career, romance, success, or whatever it may be in life, is going through the world as, in quotations, an ugly person. And she's pretty much saying that while there are these other more outward and discussed forms of discrimination, when you are not traditionally good looking or attractive, well, the world is actually really tough for you. And the worst thing is that people are so unobservant, or they just don't realize, they're ignorant to the fact that their attractiveness in the world gives them incredible privilege that they don't earn and that they go through life not acknowledging. So I thought that was a really interesting kind of angle for us to have a quick chat on.
Yeah, I think the observation's like 100% right. If we could have in the Anti-Discrimination Act an objective measure of being ugly, I think it would be in there, but of course there isn't. And the other thing is there's no association for equity for ugly peoples.
Yeah, no one's arguing that, are they? Oh, no, maybe they are. The Fugly Act of 1960.
So, yeah, like you need to like sign up to be accredited as an ugly person to,
Maybe they can give you one of those stickers so you can park in the disabled spots.
Do you think, okay, so we've talked about like the rainbow Palestinian flag. Do you think there's, what would be the color to add for ugly peoples?
Well, I was going to get myself in trouble because I thought, the ugly, when I think of what the ugliest color is, I think of like my kids choosing crayons and Play-Doh and stuff, and it's brown. That's not going to work, is it?
Yeah, no, probably not. Or the International Day of Ugly Peoples, I think...
St. Paddy's Day? I love Irish people, by the way. That was just silly.
Like, I mean, okay, so being conventionally attractive is like an endowment, right? It's not something you're born... Sorry, it's not something you work hard and you acquire it, although like that, there's a bit of grey area with that too, because like a lot of people put a lot of effort into their appearance, both in terms of keeping fit or eating healthy or a lot of like
that's
a
true.
beauty
You can
range thing.
change.
So
You can change elements.
Yeah, and like I think, you know, probably there's a lot of people who might meet the like conventional definition of attractive, that when you see them without makeup or whatever, or if they eat a little bit too much of the McDonald's or something like that, you know, they would get accredited from the association. But like, I guess the point is that it's this idea that like if you have a disadvantage in terms of your appearance, like even just like, you know, your base, your foundation that you've got to work with isn't amenable to getting in the, you know, attractive person club, then yeah, you probably do miss out. And I guess the other one is, you know, intelligence, right? That's the other one.
Before we get off the whole ugly thing, attractive thing, let's set a few things, right? So number one, we're both agreeing that this is a real thing, right? Like it should be undeniable that if you are conventionally attractive, there are a lot of advantages that you get in life, whether it be how people treat you, succession into jobs, obviously like romantic attraction, getting away with things, halo effects. Can we find some agreement there?
I think it's like more nuanced. Like I do think I think there's like threshold effects at play here. Like if you take the people who are, let's say, conventionally attractive, right? You know, they have access to possibly opportunities that other people don't, right? So halo effects are like people wanting to be in their circle or whatever. That I think is a thing. But once you get below that sort of upper tier, it's probably more a threshold effect. Like, so it's like if you're passable, like, yep, okay, then you can participate in society relatively normally. You can, you know, people will associate with you, they'll treat you with respect, all those sorts of things, right? Workplace or whatever. But if you're really ugly, like that's it. And look, we talked about this a little bit in our very, very early episode on, you know, fatphobic, right? Like there is like a structural disadvantage to overweight people, right? And that isn't quite the same thing as being ugly, of course, but like that's the similar kind of idea, right? That there's certain disadvantages. But anyway, yeah.
Yeah, look, okay. So where I was going to go with that is that I think there should be a general acknowledgement. And yes, you could have a look at like the bell curve of it and the upper echelons. You know, if you look like Alec Baldwin when he was in his, you know, late 20s, or Angelina Jolie, you know, then there is an incredible kind of advantage that's given to you, right? Because you are in the very, very top tiers of how attractive a human can be, right? And that magnetism in the world will change people's behavior towards you, and it's a good kind of yardstick because it happens so frequently that you don't even start to really understand what's happening. You just think people are nice because everyone's nice to you or whatever it is, right? And I think that can occur for people who so the reason I bring that up is that what happens sometimes, I feel, is people don't even want to acknowledge that. They don't even want to kind of say that attractiveness is important or a meaningful or significant factor in advantage or privilege in the world. And I think that's a mistake. You need to acknowledge it because it's a real thing. And I think if you're honest with yourself, you know it's a real thing, right? So that's the first thing I want to say this, that yes, like you should. And how we talk about these things do matter in some ways. Like we have to recognize our limitations as just, you know, social, you know, humans in this world. So that's why I brought that up. Now, going into other areas, like I think that, you know, while the hard thing with attractiveness is that we like to believe from Hollywood that there's this stereotype of, or this archetype of like the really hot but stupid person. You know what I mean? Like the kind of like attractive, the gorgeous idiot that goes through life kind of getting all the benefits from being physically attractive but has nothing going on between their you know, ears. I don't think that's true. Like actually the most horrible thing, the most kind of cosmically unfair thing in some ways is when you meet a really attractive person and it's not that. It's just like they have won the genetic lottery and they have it all. And I actually think that in a lot of ways is more common than the other end of the scale. And
can I just touch on that? I'm not 100% sure about that. Like I think and I know what you're talking about, but I think what possibly sometimes happens is you get these really like, they're just ambitious. They're driven by like achieving things and self-pride and self-care or whatever, right? And they apply the same thing that makes them get up at 5 a.m. to go to the gym to look absolutely 100% perfect, and then spend hours and hours, you know, manicuring their appearance or whatever on the base of whatever they're gifted with. the thing that makes them do that is the same thing that makes them do like 5 degrees or something, right? And try and excel in their career. It's just this relentless, like, so the thing that they actually have isn't smarts and attractiveness.
Yeah, I think it's like the drive,
It's drive, yeah. And because like I'm pretty sure, like, I'll go on a limb and say this: you can make any attractive person ugly. Like there's a version of them that's ugly out there. Like, like seriously, like take like I mean, I you know, we not to pick out any individual, but like, you know, you stop, like when they stop taking care of themselves, like everything goes, like, and it's like the other trope is the take the glasses off the nerd and suddenly she's a beauty.
Yeah,
you know,
what I mean?
those
90s movies. Yeah, I mean, probably a good place to look for that is retired sports stars for sure, like Ronaldo, right? Ronaldo in retirement is a pretty confronting sight. You know, but I think there is a difference. Like I am applying a control lens here for weight, because I think on men, or on both genders, weight can really screw up the situation, right? But I'm just thinking, if you control for weight, there is an objective still, like attractiveness index. And that's kind of what I'm working with. Like the people who are like far down on that index, yeah, I get it, right? Like it sucks because
what do you mean? Just like a big schnoz or something? Like what's the...
Oh, well, look, I mean, if you had to, it's kind of like bad art. When you know, right? But if you have to break it down in a more scientific way, it's, you know, the fact that their face is not symmetrical, they have slightly unbalanced features, thin lips, all sorts of weird things going on. Like you could break it down scientifically if you wanted to, but I mean, we don't have to. You know, like you kind of know, right? When you...
But the other thing too, like we in recent weeks had a conversation about like age, right? Age discrimination, right? In the workplace, like,
yeah, and this is adjacent.
This is like another version of it, right? And although classically, let's take one of these really attractive people, right? Let's pick on like a woman in the workplace, right? Who is in her 20s and 30s, is like everyone wants to be around. Like she's very attractive, and she has used that in her career, right? And then suddenly she's in her 40s and her 50s and then 60s, and that kind of starts to sort of, that allure by that age kind of starts to dissipate, right? Then that's kind of like an effect that happens, right? So it's more taking away the advantage rather than age becoming a disadvantage necessarily. But yeah, I don't know. I still like, I have hope. Like part of me is just like anyone can be made to look attractive if there's the right combination.
Anyone can be made to be passable. Like most people can be made passable, and the bar is it's a very low bar for men compared to women. But I think a lot of effort goes a long way with any of these things, like how you dress. I mean, there's a million things you can do, and that alone should tell you how important this is to us. That there is so many industries, like multi-billion-dollar industries, set up around the way you look, right? Masked under the health and beauty and all this kind of stuff. It's important. Acknowledge it. I get it. I feel for it. We don't talk about it enough. That actually, like, all things being equal, when you go for a job, the more attractive candidate is going to get the role.
Okay. Do you think there's any? All right. So let's just broaden this a little bit. So we talk about like intelligence, right? So with intelligence, on average, and let's just use IQ as a proxy for intelligence for brevity, a low IQ person will not have as much access to like opportunity and success in their life, right?
Dude, it's called real estate, right? And, you know, I think...
Well, the irony is it's the low IQ people who probably like got on a Bitcoin like in the like early 2010s, and now they're...
That story is still unfolding, Andy.
But like, okay, but let's just say high IQ people can typically just... They've got this endowment. They were born. They can grapple with different situations. They can, progress in education perhaps easier. They like even just more street smarts, whatever. Like, IQ is a fairly malleable thing. It doesn't translate to academic book smarts. It could be other kinds of smarts as well, right? But that's going to assist them. It's like this superpower they've got, right? And equally, if you're low IQ, if you're below, let's say the 100, so-called average sort of score, then that's a disadvantage. So. But then the thing someone might say is, yeah, but like that may be the case, and there may be discrimination in some respects, but that form of discrimination isn't necessarily pernicious, because if, let's say, you want, surgeons, you want people who can tell the difference between that critical artery that is going to save the person versus the one that's going to kill them. And yes, you need the best of the best to be doing those roles. So that's why, Like, is there a similar case? Can you say that in the same way as you can for hierarchy of people, that you want them in the most important jobs or consequential jobs, can you say the same thing for attractiveness? Like, can you make an argument to say that that is fair game to discriminate? So let's say in sales would be a perfect example. So is it justified or is it completely unjustified?
Yeah, look, I think that...
and I don't mean the catwalk.
No. Beauty or attractiveness is a proxy for health or for, I suppose, fertility. Like that's where it comes from, right? That's why we're attracted to youth and attracted to beauty through symmetry and all that kind of stuff, because it indicates high fertility, it indicates health, right? That is no longer the case in modern society, right? Like, there's no attractive person is not going to live longer than a less conventionally attractive person. So I think taking that aside, like, it doesn't have the same signaling effects that could be used, I suppose, for that purpose. If we're talking about attractiveness, when it comes to just the realities of human psychology, or this kind of like influencing human behavior to get an outcome that you want for your business or for whatever it is, then yes, of course, there's a reason why the pharmaceutical industry hires like hot agents, right? Because they're able to manipulate the situation to give themselves a competitive advantage, right? So I think that like the problem I have is not how we got here. It's more the way that we are truthful, like how truthful we are about the situation, which I think is healthy to be truthful about it and honest about it. And also, when does it cross over into exploitation? And not just for like in that farmer girl situation, but what about the people on the other end that are getting manipulated and are being kind of exploited on both sides? I guess that's the issue. You can definitely make a case for it, of course. Like, it makes sense to me.
I don't have quite as like an alarmist view of it. Like, I think like it is what it is. Humans, going to make decisions based on a whole range of things, and there's going to be all sorts of psychological factors at play. Like,
I'm not alarmist. Just like be honest about it.
Yeah. But like, I think to me this is just like the classic argument. Like, if you want to start equalizing for income, why don't you equalize as well for attractiveness? Like, these are things which, like, there's all sorts of inequalities that exist, and government can't expect to like equalize everything, right? So for me, this is just more of like a general argument about why it's not helpful to get too caught up in the specific single like univariate factor that explains why, two people might be treated differently, but focus on more the fact that two people are treated differently. And so for me, like, if you look at someone who is impoverished and really doesn't have a lot of opportunity or good things going on in their life, you can have a conversation about like, what are the different attributes of that person that might, we should address that, and we should address the fact that people with this on average are more likely to be, a disadvantage. But like, at the end of the day, why don't we just look at disadvantaged people and help disadvantaged people? And for like, no matter what attributes or characteristics they have, because some are more obvious and others are not. Like, if you've got a mental health condition, people can't see that. It's not visible.
I agree.
So focus on the inequality and the disadvantage itself, not the...
Yeah, I agree. But taking it back to this particular, the start of this, is more, I think this woman is feeling more just that it's not the fact that she...
By the way, can I ask, was this person like an ugly person?
Yes. I wouldn't say ugly is the wrong word. She used that word. I wouldn't ever refer to that, not just out of kindness, but because I don't think it's accurate. But anyway, what she's actually getting to the heart of is like, I'm not asking for everyone to give me, like, for all the attractive people in my life to call out their privilege. But that's exactly what all these other race warriors are doing. So I think you got to remember it's coming from that place too, that actually like, all right, if you want to start banging on about X, Y, and Z in this niche element, then what about the rest of the stuff? And I kind of get that too.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I mean, I agree with that. I mean, that's kind of along the theme of what I was just saying, like, in terms of call out like, exactly. Don't.
But also, it's like a rat race. Don't you feel sometimes like we all should just disarm a little bit? Because if there was and there are obviously operations you can get, this proliferation of Brazilian butt lifts, BBLs, and all these kind of like really invasive ways to make yourself look more attractive to the opposite sex, and in general, like surgeries. There's even surgeries now to like, cut and grow your bones to get taller and stuff like that. And it's just a race to the bottom where we'd just be all a lot better. Just everyone disarm, stop the arms race. Yeah, take the makeup off, take the eyeliner off, like just everyone just settle down,
I just wish I could go back to the Renaissance where like being really fat was like a sign of wealth and prosperity.
But like this, because things are getting out of hand, right? Like, and even when you think about it, as much as we go on about how persons of color and so on and white beauty standards and whitewashing, there are so many places around the world where some of the most popular skincare categories are ones that are aimed at bleaching or lightening your skin, right? And they are doing it to themselves. And you know what I'm saying? So there's a lot of things here that are reacting to the realities of the world. And I think that how we combat that is you put some sunlight into the conversation and you admit it. Be a bit more honest.
Well, you better
about
not
things.
let too much sunlight in, otherwise someone might get a tan. So,
all right.
Listener question. All right, let me roll one up for you, Roger. And just to be very clear, I did not write this question. Okay. Dear Andy and Roger, your take on Doge. Are we still calling it Doge, or is it Doge, or has it got some other?
Dogecoin, yeah.
Doge. Okay, let me start again. Your take on Doge and government spending felt a bit naive and under-researched. That's pretty harsh.
That's our search optimization words for the show.
It didn't show much understanding of what government does or what Trump and Musk are really aiming for. Isn't the real goal of Doge to enrich people like them, either by actually saving $2 trillion or just creating the illusion of it to justify tax cuts for the rich? It also plays into the promises made, promises kept image. America first, anti-DEI, and draining the so-called deep state. And Musk? He's making sure his government-funded companies don't get investigated anymore. Also, when you say government is inefficient, what exactly do you mean? The public service hasn't grown since the early 90s, even with 10 million more people here living in Australia. Doesn't that suggest more is being done with less? From our listener, Rob. Just some context, this is a throwback to episode number 120, where we discussed Doge, and we had a little bit of a discussion about the role of Elon Musk in the Trump presidency.
Yeah. A good question. And, I must say that Doge and discussions around that have created a lot of anecdotal feedback, and, we've received a lot of messages and things. People really care about it. I think it's very divisive, like a lot of things in this administration. I feel like that question obviously is tough because our friend Rob, and thank you for listening and thank you for contacting, is mainly at odds with a lot of my positions rather than yours, Andy. But you got thrown. You've been tarred by the same brush, obviously.
We're in the same cabinet.
Yeah. You're a dirty chai by association. So look, I think we can pick apart a few things there, right? And I will. But I think in subsequent chats from when we received this listener question, I think there has been an acknowledgement that, hey, Elon and the optics and how they're going about this particular efficiency study, let's call it, is not right. And I think that I would concede that, and I would concede that actually the methods, this kind of the cruelty, or maybe the hapless cruelty of how it's being done is not very popular, and I would never kind of go out on a limb for them in that way, right? Appearing on stage with a chainsaw and the disrespect in which they're treating some of their long-serving employees that have stayed loyal to them as civic servants. So, I want to acknowledge that element. I think in terms of doubling down on what I believe we both agree on is that there is money to be saved in government, and that actually government is involved, or the size of government is involved in probably things that still could be scaled back and could be made much more efficient in terms of spending. So I think both those two things can be true as just like a very high level 2 markers of that conversation, right? And correct me if I'm wrong there, Andy, whether you don't agree with that. And then the other thing around, like, I hear this line all the time about how government's not inefficient because it hasn't really grown since the 90s. Or when was the stat that he said?
The 90s, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So look, I think that if we just look at the US, which is where Doge is going on, yes, okay, maybe like the amount of people or so on, there's something to be said there around the increases, but it also has, we're talking about the federal spending has grown from like 980 million to over 7 trillion or whatever it is, right? So I'm not sure that you can make just a clear-cut argument about that either. But anyway, keen on your thoughts.
Okay, well, just to those numbers, I think some of them were referring to Australia, not the US. So I think to the nature of the conversation we had on the day was like kind of how you should assess government and how government, like, yeah, okay, of course you can find savings somewhere, but like I want to sort of propose like a bit of a framework of thinking about this, right? Almost like the efficiency frontier, right? Imagine like a line, and there's like it's a frontier. So this is like the maximum level of efficiency you can achieve. So as in the maximum that government can deliver for that given budget, but the level of service delivered by government increases and decreases as you move along that frontier. So it's, if you're, let's say, just to give it more in thought experiment territory, if you have a government with $100 billion to spend, they'll give you a certain suite of services. If they have $200 billion to spend, they'll definitely deliver you a lot more services and for that budget, right? And so you can look at government and say it's not at the efficiency frontier, at whatever position it's at, right? And you can say there is a program of work that you could commence to try and get it to the efficiency frontier for its given level of budget, right? And that's true. That's just probably by definition going to be true, because to be at the efficiency frontier is this like almost impossible place to be. But that's not what's been going on here. What's been going on here is a move sideways, not to the efficiency frontier, but just to trade off services to save money. Like, let's just cut services. And actually at the same time probably move away from the efficiency frontier even further, because at that different level of budget, because what they've kind of done is they've kind of actually made a lot of these services ineffective and worse, and and we'll see that in the coming years. So I think that's kind of how I see it. So it's one thing to be able to concede that they can do better, which I think is almost like a truism. Like it would be hard to argue otherwise. But then to look at the kind of stuff they're doing, like, oh, let's abolish the education department as they've just done, and not really understand what the consequences of that are, but because it makes a good headline.
Well, yeah. And I think that, let's get a few things out of the way.
And sorry,
first.
just to clarify, a good headline to the MAGA people, not to everyone else.
Let's get a few things out of the way first. So, we do not believe, and nor should anyone really, that Doge is going to turn around the deficit or anything crazy like that sometimes you hear leave the mouth of less kind of sophisticated commentators. So that's obviously not true. And the vast expenditure around these essentially social welfare, disability and Medicaid spending for their own citizens is the bulk of what's driving a lot of this structural spending, right? And so Doge is not touching those things. So it's just not possible, right? And I think that you could send a letter home to every employee and it's still not going to make a dent, right? So this is actually a good thing to and a popular thing to deal with waste elements, and there are always waste elements, like you said, as a truism that you can do better. But Doge is not going to fix those bigger structural elements in the spending of the US government, right? So what is it doing? My sympathies for it when we're discussing it is that you have to, I believe culturally, when you're dealing with a large incumbency, so to speak, you have to go in a little bit big. You have to kind of go in, and yes, you don't want to cut into the muscle, but at the same time, if you try to make little refining changes and you don't try to address like the changing of the culture or send key messages to that effect, often what happens is nothing at all. Like you rearrange some deck chairs and then it just all snaps back into place, right? And so what they're trying to do, and I have sympathy for those elements, is to try to get a proper step change in some of this stuff, right? Which includes maybe in a misguided way some of this idea of like moving fast and breaking things. If they cancel a service and then they find out it's super important, they put it back in or whatever it is, right? Like I think that is one method to try to deal with the Leviathan that is the US, government.
There's probably a couple of things worth pointing out. One is that like the size of the US government is actually quite small. Like if you look at government spending in the United States as a percentage of GDP, it's actually much smaller than most advanced countries. And in fact, a lot of people would say what's actually needed in America is actually the opposite. You need more social public goods, services, things like healthcare and support for people who are in the most, underprivileged situation. Like that's actually what America needs, not the opposite. I don't think the offensiveness of the Elon Musk thing is like the chainsaw or the, it's just the tone deafness of it. I think it's just that like, well, I don't know if you actually do give him credit, but like this framing of like, oh, they're trying to do this, I don't think they're trying to do anything. I don't think they know what they're doing. I really honestly don't think it's that methodical. I think they're just like, I think they're bull in a china shop and it's just like, oh, well, I broke that. Okay, that's a good idea. All right. Oh yeah, I've got some people saying, oh, as a Department of Education, what do I say? Oh, okay, there might be some, I don't think there's any thoughtfulness to it. And I think that's actually what's so offensive. And this just gets to the nature of government versus private sector. So often what a lot of the consultant types, for example, in the private sector, a lot of people say, oh, well, Elon Musk, like he actually doesn't understand government, so he shouldn't be in here doing this. What a lot of people outside of government don't appreciate is that there are different constraints and it's a different operating reality. So this isn't about like, how do you make widgets in using the least resources? This is actually like, how do you navigate all of your stakeholders, which are much more complex, which could be, you've got often unionized workforces, you've got very complex stakeholders in that you're operating in a political environment. This is so much more complicated than trying to manage an organization where you have a board who cares and shareholders who care about profits and a vision and a plan for profitability in the longer term. Like that's not the environment that you're operating in when you're in government. You've got to balance lots of things, otherwise things are going to fuck up and you're going to cause problems down the track. So, and I think what has made a lot of this Elon Musk stuff almost, the only reason this is even happening is because you've got such a wild president who almost gives the cover. And in fact, I think Trump's probably mindset is that he doesn't mind,
he's loving it.
Musk being the bad guy, and because he can come and like fix the mistakes at the end, like and be the good guy. But I guess back to the efficiency frontier analogy that I gave before, you want to make sure that in moving from like, let's say BMW or a Mercedes, that you're moving to say a Toyota and not like, a Kia kind of thing. Like you want to, sorry, Kia's perfectly great car, but yeah.
They sponsor the Australian Open.
Like you want, I don't know. I was trying to think like, what would be what would be a shit car brand? Like Nissan? I don't know.
No, I'll probably
Suzuki.
say a Hyundai. Probably a Hyundai for our American listeners, but Hyundai.
Oh no, they're great.
They are now, but I mean, I think they were
okay. But you get the point, right? You in going from the premium European high stock down the lower to the lower cost end of you want government to be lower cost. You want to stay at the like this is the best that our money can buy territory, not
all right.
Where
let's help me here, Andy. Kind of, because I think what I'm agreeing with and what we agreed in that particular conversation about Doge was that there is inefficiency, traditional, how the private sector would see inefficiency in government. Because I understand what you mean about government is working to a range of different constraints that are complicated and are more advanced than what the private sector often thinks of in terms of operating environment. But that's not the argument that you hear. You hear that actually because of that, there's not inefficiency in the sense of what we're talking about. So it becomes a semantic play around what inefficiency means, right? So kind of help me out here in terms of like where the middle ground here is.
Well, I think what some people might see as inefficiency is actually not inefficiency. It's just the way that organization manages risk, manages its stakeholders. So for example, you might have a team dedicated on hand to do a task just in case it's needed. in a way that you couldn't justify in the private sector. But you have to have it in the public sector, because if you're not prepared to respond, if that organization doesn't have that capability to respond to that thing in that particular way, then that's a problem. And you gave an example in the episode we did on this around emails, right? And around, okay, you can just let your email inbox sort of, get out of control, and then if there's anything really truly important, it'll come up some other way.
Yeah, not saying that I do that.
Yeah,
saying that email bankruptcy is a strategy that is used.
I think that's true, but like at the same time, you're dealing with a completely different risk profile in government, and that doesn't mean it's not inefficient by some metric, but then the metric that government's operating in, and you have to remember, is that like government organizations don't lack the same kind of competitive tensions that exist in the private sector, right? So those tensions do exist because you do have, let's say at the leadership level, you do have competition, like managerial talent, right? There are people who are known as public sector leaders who come in and can play the role of whipping an organization into shape, and they do exist, and that's their thing, right? And they're very competent at doing that, and they do kind of try and make things they do change things, and they might even be radical change in the same way as what you've outlined. But the thing is, they know government, they know the environments of government, and they can do that with that knowledge of government. Whereas we're talking about
And did you believe that from an employee security point of view, that government employees are more secure than private sector employees in a comparative field?
Well, not because they're employees of government, but it's usually because they're often highly unionized, and that's the nature of a highly unionized sort of bargaining framework. I mean, one of the examples would be a public transportation network, right? If you require your trains to be staffed by a heavily unionized workforce, it doesn't matter whether you're government or whether you're public or private sector, like you're going to face the same challenges with that workforce.
This is where I'm getting to, where you can understand the reasons why, but it still gets you to the same spot.
Okay, well let me reverse it on you. Do you think that the only reason why, let's say, it's harder to get rid of sounds very disposable, but like it's easier to hire and fire in the private sector, is because no one in government has had the bright idea that actually this thing of like job security is like that just hadn't occurred to anyone, and that it would take someone from the private sector to make that happen?
So I think that this is where we get into cultural elements of why.
But is it cultural, or is it just a reflection of the actual reality of what these organizations do? Because that's my point.
So
you can't control that you've got a unionized workforce. That's not something in your or if you're going to control that, then there's a lot of other things that you have to.
Let me paint you a picture. So let's go to the private sector where I have more experience. The vast majority of deep cut hatcheting restructures are performed with the aid of external consultancies for their operating model and so on. So even in a private sector environment, it's still done that way, because there's a reality of, like, if you just ask, the system to do it to itself, you rarely get the outcome that you want, right? Like, unfortunately. So it's a way, it's a political thing sometimes. It's a way of taking an impartial third party and pinning the action on them. It's about breaking down that culture and long-standing politics and vestigial parts of the organization that might exist because the things that you're talking about around risk mitigation happen all the time in different industries, whether they go under an enforceable undertaking, all of a sudden they bloat up certain, quality assurance teams or whatever it may be. Like, this kind of ebbs and flows. And I think that what remains is the cultural and political landscape to adapt quickly. And maybe that's a better way of describing it. Like, government culture is slower to adapt in some areas, which gives a traditional sense of inefficiency constraints, right? And I think that's why, right? Like, I know none of this is revolutionary, but sometimes forcing these changes do shift the culture, which allows this kind of thinking to occur, right? That's my view.
I think it's probably more that you can't, this whole, like, let's just demolish the thing and then rebuild, creative destruction almost, right? You can't do that in government. that's more the point, right? So this whole thing of like Elon Musk did this at, you know, the whole I'm going to save costs on building rockets because, you know, there's all this crazy, like, why would we spend $400,000 acquiring some part that we can go to like Bunnings to get, you know, for $300? Like, yeah, great, like that's amazing. But in government, there is stuff that conventionally like would meet the test of inefficient, but if you want to change it, you have to have something. You have to have the pathway to change it. You can't just wish it to be different and then everything solves itself in between, because you have the government who continues to have an obligation to the people of the community who continue to expect services to be delivered.
Yeah, but you're thinking about very like...
No, but like this is the heart of it, right?
For everything, I mean, that might be an element of it. But there's also like, you know, the Pentagon famously having the $600 toilet seat. You know, there's also little things along the way that
maybe the toilet seat is worth it. Maybe it's a like
it was very hard to get the Pentagon like actual angles.
Yeah, but there's no shortage. Like, I know nothing about that toilet seat, by the way. But there's no shortage of like seemingly irrational things, but that actually do have rational explanations. Like my problem with, I think, the Doge thing isn't that it's got nothing to do with the fact that it isn't a viable strategy to focus on culture, because of course like culture is critical, right? And so I don't think I'm not saying to you, like, I'm not disagreeing with the notion that cultural change isn't like an important part of a transformation or whatever, but more that this is not what we're getting with Doge. This is just mindless kind of, bull in a china shop. And I think your notion of, well, you know, the private sector would do this thing where they'll get external people in and they will completely revolutionize, redesign it. You might do a version of that in government, and that may be warranted, but you also can't do that thing like you mentioned with email, because you need to make sure that little old grandmas have their surgeries on time before they die, you know, or whatever, right? So like these fundamental things kind of you can't wear those costs in the same way as in the private sector.
But like I said, even under that analogy, right? So grandma's getting a payment, right? But we missed a payment to a grandma, and then it was in the news. So there's now a department doing a sample check of all payments to all grandmas, and that could be
the grandma payment checking department.
No, I'm serious. This is absolutely, this stuff happens, and then because it happens in private sector too, and then instead of actually fixing the root cause of the problem, which, you know, this happened because of like, you know, a load assurance issue in the payment system that's been well understood by the engineers that look after the system for many, many years. And instead of fixing that, they keep on bloating out the person. All of a sudden, there's now a head of the grandma checking department, and their interests are aligned with, you know, keeping their organization, part of their organization working instead of fixing the root cause. And round we go. You know, it's a very human problem. And you scale that up into all these different ways and put the political pressures in, and that's all I mean. That I think that there is a definition of inefficiency that could be agreed upon, and that can be stated without all this vitriol of like trying to say that government people are lazy or that they shouldn't be doing anything. Like that's, you know. Yeah, of course.
But I think you push back at the notion that you'd get people to you'd work within the system to find out. You know,
these people do. These external consultancies do, right? Like they have to work within the system.
To your example of the grandma money payment checking department, I mean, a version of that was actually implemented here in Australia within the last decade.
You talking about the robo debt?
Yeah, I mean, like that's a perfect example of like the nature of government. So robo debt, for anyone who doesn't know, was when the government was seeking. It was part of a broader fiscal consolidation, which is nerdy speak for let's fix the budget sort of thing, right? That what we would do is we would, rather than, you know, just hope that people out of the goodness of their own hearts will repay what they're owed, whether because it'll say they've been overpaid as like a social security payment, right? Rather than trust that they'll do that, what we'll do is we'll just send a whole bunch of automatic debt recovery letters and various other things, and then we'll get more money coming in, and that's good. Except that they did that without the mechanisms to make sure that the people who they issued those notices to actually owed the money. And then those people had no recourse, and then they had to pay, and they actually didn't owe the money. And that's the issue. That's what happens in government. You can't do things like that. The other one's pink bats. Like,
Yeah.
people died because of government policy. Like, you have to think about you have to really be careful. So I'm just saying there's a different version of that transformation. But let's get off this aspect of the conversation, come back to another thing that we didn't actually discuss on the day, but I think it's actually like we missed. Well, I don't think it's that we missed it. I just think it's that we just didn't touch on it. But it's this notion that this whole thing is actually more pernicious than just simply a circus. That this is actually about lining the pockets of Elon Musk, either directly or there's some, and then the broader point about like that this is essentially to fund, or at least part of this, including tariffs as well in the mix, is to fund like essentially tax cuts for the rich, right?
Well, there's a lot of conspiracy in this, room for conspiracy here as well. And let me just say, why I laughed, I'm not laughing at the cutting of these services. If this was a grand scheme to line the pockets of Elon for his companies, then this must be a very long game that he's trying to run.
Well, I don't know. I'm not as
you don't
generous
believe
as you.
there's been actual damage that's been done to Tesla, to the brand reputation?
Well, I think that's just probably more the lack of self-awareness of Elon Musk, not to realize that he isn't the hero that he thought he was when he got the chainsaw out at that right-leaning conference that he went to. They don't all love him. America doesn't love Elon Musk. I think he's like, and that probably, that's probably like a trauma he didn't know that he was getting himself into. But to the point of like why this is actually quite serious, like, is that, and again, I say this, government is different to the private sector, but like probity is so important in government. Like probity is everything, like, because it goes to trust, it goes to, if people don't have confidence in government, and if people think government is just like on the take, then, people, it's just like a slippery slope. People lose trust. So I think the notion that you can just rock in there like as the richest man on the planet who has lots of government contracts or there's lots of like financial relationships intermingled, and you're going in there and you're looking at doing all these things and you're not declaring any of your interests, and it's not transparent, and it's God knows what's happening. It's actually just, okay. It's a different way of doing it. That's all I can say.
There was this kind of video that went viral, and it was, I believe it was just a bit of a satire thing, but it was set up to be one of the, Elon's young engineers coming into a government department and doing like a random, raid or audit, where the guy was like, "Ma'am, I need your laptop and I need to stick this thumb drive in." And she's like, "Nope, I'm not going to be doing that." And she just like picked up her stuff and she's like, "Ma'am, this is Trump's America and I don't need consent to stick a thumb in anymore." I just thought to myself, what would you do? Like if these young brats came in and they're obviously trying to, collect metadata and stuff to determine, their analysis, would you, and like, it hadn't been done in the most copacetic way where there was a town hall and your leader told your leader and their leader told their leader, and then finally you had a one-on-one conversation that, hey, the Doge consultants are coming on this day and you need to cooperate with them. Like, how would you handle it?
Probably take the payout.
Netflix and chill. Anyway, that's
I'd move to New Zealand or maybe Australia. Yeah.
Look, I think that the notion that this is some of the theories that I've heard too around, like, if Trump is really just eroding the confidence in government in general, in these institutions, and then at the same time, like, Doge cuts the spending, creates chaos, and degrades the services significantly, it becomes a bit of a self-fulfilling or like a virtuous cycle in some ways that, yes, they're not cutting Medicare and all these other services, but you're calling these departments, you can't get through because there's no staff there anymore, or the staff is compromised and management's compromised, then you are effectively altering the provisioning of services, and that has a material impact over time around people. Like in the same way that maybe some people argue about the police. There's lots of stories, and I know people that have that work with me too, and they all have these stories on the West Coast of calling the cops, and the cops are like, like they call it saying like someone's breaking into the house next door or this car, whatever. They I can see them, and the police are like, "Oh, we can only get there in like 90 minutes. Can you just like wait?" So it's like, how many times do you have that experience where then you just don't call the cops anymore, and then you call your private security. And then everything just becomes like privatized in a way. And like, is there a bigger play around this? Like pushing these people out, they won't, that they want them to get jobs in the private sector, and just like disperse out.
Around the time of COVID, Tyler Cohen started floating this idea of like state capacity libertarianism. And it's like this idea that like, okay, so the libertarian movement is like almost universally has been about, small government, like, maybe like historically would have like lapped this shit up, right? This whole Doge stuff. Probably would have realized it's flawed fundamentally, but like at least
although
the
they
notion
definitely support getting rid of the Department of Education. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, well, I have been on. I think I've discussed why education's a waste of time and money before. So on this pod, so I shouldn't maybe use that as an example. But anyway, the point though is that with this whole state capacity libertarianism kind of concept is that all right, you don't want like government being bigger than it needs to be, but actually you need a competent government. You need actually the government to be actually really good at its core functions and what it's actually there to do, because eventually you're going to have situations where you actually really need a competent government. COVID would be a good example, like the fact that they actually could stand up like, Operation Warp Speed or whatever to develop the vaccine as quickly as they did. Donald Trump could say, not that it had anything to do with him actually, but like he could claim it. It happened when he was president. So to that extent, he definitely could have been talking about that as, see, look, we actually are good at delivering.
Doesn't that just pausing there, Andy, doesn't that give you faith that the system is working?
No, because he's destroying the system that made it work. That's the problem. So the thing that made that possible in that area is being eroded in these other areas. So Elon Musk is destroying the capacity of government to respond to and be effective when it needs to be. And in a very complex sort of geopolitical environment where we've got all these new developments relating to AI, and you've got China on your tails, you've got, all sorts of things going on.
Hey, don't pull Elon into the tariffs.
But like, is this really the time to be focusing on how we can weaken government to save a few pennies, as opposed to actually maybe... And like, I want to be clear, like I've said before, I'm a small government person, right? Like that's my philosophical view of the world. Like I think, the more that you can leave to the private sector, the better. So that is my starting point. But at the same time, for the government that we do have, we want them to be good at it. And that's the problem with it. That's fundamentally what the issue is.
Yeah. I'm definitely here to hear that argument. And disaster response is another one. We in Australia, we just had cyclone preparations and things, and it's just human nature to want something from nothing, like to expect that there's a task force ready to go, but then complain about carrying the weight of supporting that said task force when the cyclone doesn't hit, right? So it's a very hard balance to strike. I get it, and people are very harsh. They don't tolerate anything, and the nature of government is that you can always vote them out and give someone else a chance, right? And I get it. But that doesn't get around the fact that sometimes creates some maladaptive situations, right? Or behaviors. I kind of still see it, though, as Doge is still relegated to areas that, yes, can create a lot of chaos and culturally doesn't look good, but it actually doesn't make government as a whole that much. It doesn't compromise the core of it. And maybe that's something that I need to look into more to change that. But
I think there's many other things that have compromised government, such as all the really terrible appointments that Trump's made.
You know what I mean?
Yeah. All right. Well, I think next week we should take on tariffs.
Yeah. Let's get some Canadians on.
Beef with that beef.